But we should talk a bit about this enormous update in the fight for abortion in this country. On Friday, the Friday news dump, Trump...
The Good Friday news dump.
Honestly, right. How Christ-like of him to essentially block medical care for half plus of the people that decide to end their pregnancies. They use the abortion pill. And this judge, a Trump appointee, Matthew Kacsmaryk, he's a known anti-abortion extremist, presides over the district court in Texas, in the Northern District of Texas, has declared that the FDA's approval of Mifepristone in 2000, so it's a 23-year-old precedent, he's decided, I'm an anti-abortion extremist, so I'm going to declare that invalid using faulty conspiratorial logic that seemed to have been copy and pasted, if not heavily borrowed, from the plaintiffs and right-wing activist groups who were pushing for this. He issued this ruling on Friday, and luckily the ruling has been stayed for a week to allow the Biden administration to appeal, so they're weighing their options right now. Also, luckily, a federal judge in Washington right afterwards issued a dueling injunction, which has compelled the FDA to allow Mifepristone to continue to be sold in 17 states and DC. Now, that doesn't help a lot of other people in the country, but the ruling has been stayed in terms of declaring the drug illegal, which isn't even in a judge's legal purview necessarily, because the FDA has a statutory authority to make these decisions about drugs, and Congress actually has a process by which the FDA could withdraw the approval of a drug, but it has to go through a long congressional procedure. And so there's many different layers to why this ruling has faulty legal underpinnings, but that doesn't necessarily matter, right? Because the right-wing activists got what they wanted, and now there's a legal framework in place to potentially make one of the two necessary drugs for the abortion pill illegal. He, in his ruling, spoke, yes, about conspiracy theories, about the side effects of the drug, even though it's known to be incredibly safe, as safe, if not safer than Tylenol. And then also some of the weird theocratic underpinnings for his ruling included the usage of something called the Comstock Act, which is a long dormant act that is essentially an anti-obscenity law from the 19th century. And this Trump-appointed extremist judge declared that mailing an abortion drug would be a federal crime using this defunct Comstock Act because it's so obscene and promiscuous and disgusting, right? Because it pertains to birth control. So it really is Handmaid's Tale level crap here. And also potentially in and of itself wildly beyond the scope of what the court should be engaged in legally. But the problem is that there is not a mechanism to check these judges in the way that they should be. We have a system of checks and balances in this country, theoretically. And this is part of what Alexandria Ocasio Cortez was saying when she was interviewed about this ruling on CNN here. In the wake of this, she went on TV and spoke about this ruling and essentially said, hey, the Biden administration, what they should do, and this is my position as well, Ron Wyden actually said this first, and then Alexandria Ocasio Cortez followed, ignore the ruling. Just ignore it based on just the good for the country and the fact that this activist judge is going way beyond the scope of what his job and his powers particularly entail. But here you go.
There has been thought, I believe, given to this. Senator Ron Wyden has already issued statements, for example, advising what we should do in a situation like this, which I concur, which is that I believe that the Biden administration should ignore this ruling. I think that the courts have the legitimacy and they rely on the legitimacy of their rulings. And what they are currently doing is engaged in an unprecedented and dramatic erosion of the legitimacy of the courts. It is the justices themselves, through the deeply partisan and unfounded nature of these rulings, that are undermining their own enforcement.
So you're saying the Biden administration should ignore this court, but what does that look like? What does that actually mean?
I think the interesting thing when it comes to a ruling is that it relies on enforcement. And it is up to the Biden administration to choose whether or not to enforce such a ruling.
But is that...
Well, yeah. I wish we had the rest of that follow-up there from Anderson Cooper, but regardless, it still is... I concur. I concur with her reasoning there. The reality is just that in the abortion... or in the Constitution, there's no right to an abortion, true. You know what also is not in the Constitution? Judicial review. Judicial review goes back to nearly the founding of the country, but it's not in the Constitution. It's in Marbury versus Madison, which is in 1803. So if we're going to look at overturning past precedent, why not start there? They will never do that. It would undermine the power of the Supreme Court significantly. But the point here is that there is one thing in the Constitution that is relevant in this instance, and that is the system of checks and balances. The legislature and the executive branch now have an opportunity to put a check on the extremist courts and the judiciary. The Biden administration has an opportunity to do it. The legislature has an opportunity to do it. And they should. They should, because a system of checks and balances is not really a system of checks and balances if one rogue body decides, hey, we're just going to do whatever the hell we want because we have a well-funded right-wing activist apparatus behind us and we're untouchable as judges. We're the priests. So for me, I like that approach. I saw some libs saying that this was an unserious take by Alexandria Ocasio Cortez. But frankly, I think it's unserious to dismiss this entirely, because if you're institutionalists, there's nothing more embedded in what's supposed to be embedded in the U.S. systems and institutions than the system of checks and balances. And right now, the court needs to be checked.